Hi Yogi, and welcome to another Asana Lab with me, Oshana. In today's episode, I'll be talking you through Cobra Pose, Bhujangasana, as well as Upward Facing Dog, Urdhva Mukha Svanasana. Essentially, oftentimes we will talk about Cobra Pose being the precursor to Upward Facing Dog, and there is a lot of overlap with those two postures, so I'm covering them, of course, together, which means I will leave some timestamps in the description for you that allow you to hop around this video. I'll be covering the sort of intentions of the poses, the basic alignment, a few misalignments that I commonly see in classes, a little bit of anatomy chat, and I'll also be talking about a few modifications that are helpful for different health conditions and just a few variations, because there's really not that many variables with these postures. So let us dive into the intentions of the pose, of course. I always think with back bends, it's very helpful to consider a basic rule of thumb that you're strengthening the back of the body and you're lengthening the front of the body. So I think often that is helpful in changing a little bit our intention or how we go into those poses. Oftentimes people hear the word back bend and think that they really have to bend from their back, which means usually crunching into their lower lumbar spine. If we're sort of thinking more about opening and lengthening the front of the body, really how we enter the postures really changes in a positive way, in my opinion, and has a positive impact on how we experience these poses. So in that sense, basically with these particular two postures, we're strengthening the wrists, the entire chain of muscles running up the arms, as well as the muscles that stabilize the shoulder joint. To a lesser degree, we're also stabilizing the core body here that supports the lumbar spine. And with good engagement, we're also strengthening the glutes and the thighs. In terms of flexibility, we, of course, because we're opening the front body, we're lengthening and stretching the abdomen, the chest, the fronts of the shoulders. And again, with really good alignment, you're also getting into your hip flexors. So a lot of benefits to these poses, really. Before I dive into the alignment, and of course, I'll show you how to get into these poses, I briefly want to touch on glute engagement in back bends. So at least when I started practicing yoga, and I think for quite a while after that as well, people would often say that you're not supposed to engage your glutes in a back bend at all, which is sort of a strange thing looking back now with everything that I know. Really the glutes, well, let's sort of backtrack a little bit. You know, the in a back bend, really the most delicate part of the spine is the lumbar spine, the lowest part around here. And the reason for that is your upper thoracic spine is very much locked in by your rib cage. And there's also a difference in how the vertebrae are built. So the vertebrae in the thoracic spine are built more for twisting, because we used to have to look around over our shoulder a lot more. Some of us probably still do, in order to protect ourselves from predators. And the lower lumbar spine was built for picking things up, forward and back bending. So forward folds and back bends, essentially. But the lower spine, you will notice there's no rib cage. There's nothing really holding it in place aside from the muscles in the core body. And that's also partly why I always talk about those muscles as a corset that wrap around our midsection to protect the lower spine. Now, of course, I am predominantly talking about the muscles in this area, but the glutes are part of what helps us stabilize the lower spine. So if you engage the glutes in a back bend, a lot of time they'll actually help you flatten the lower back curve slightly, which sort of lessens the back bend in that area, which is beneficial in the long term. You might be thinking, but I want to go as deep as I can every time. But really, you do want to go into your back bends with as much stability in that area as you can. And the secondary thing that also happens really in most yoga poses, there's sort of a juxtaposition going on of one part of your body that's moving and another part of your body that really wants to stay as stable and grounded as it can. And the more you can stabilize, the more the fixed part of your body, I should say, the more the part of your body that's moving is able to move, because it's really fixed on one point and then very, very mobile and movable from the rest. It gives it actually more freedom of movement. So engaging your glutes, in my opinion, will always improve your back bends, especially in these two. It's very obvious. So how to engage your glutes correctly? There is a little bit of a sweet spot here. So the best analogy that I've ever heard came from one of my teachers, Catherine Budig, and she said, you sort of have to bear with me on this analogy slightly. You really want to imagine yourself holding a grape between your butt cheeks. Yes, I know. And you want to be squeezing that grape tightly enough that it doesn't roll away, but not so tight that you end up with grape juice. So you're engaging the glutes, but you're not, overly squeezing them. We don't have to go into too much detail, but hopefully, as it did with me, that analogy will now be brained into your visual memory, so you will never forget not to engage your glutes in a back bend. So let me come onto the floor and show you. So because essentially upward facing dog uses a lot of the same alignment as Cobra Pose, I will demonstrate Cobra Pose for you, and then I'll talk you through just a few tweaks that we do in order to come all the way into our upward facing dog from here. Because we're dissecting these postures in isolation, right now I will talk you through building them from the ground up. But of course, normally we would do our upward facing dog, especially as part of a vinyasa flow. So we would be coming into it in a slightly different way. So let's start with Cobra Pose. Essentially, the foundations, of course, are the hands, the front of the body pressing into the floor, and our feet. So the hands, in my opinion, I prefer to have the hands under the shoulders. Some teachers and lineages do talk about the hands being closer to the mid or lower rib cage. Personally, I think that puts a little bit too much pressure on the wrists, and it also causes the shoulders to drop forward for a lot of people, including myself. So hands underneath the shoulders puts them at shoulder width, fingertips are spread, and from here the all 10 toes are pressing into the floor. I tend to like to think a little bit more about pressing my pinky toes down, because then that internally rolls my thighs in. So as the thighs roll in, they're actually creating more space and width in the lower back area around the sacrum here, which is where the sacrum and spine attach into the hip joint. So we're rolling the thighs in towards one another, hands underneath the shoulders, elbows pointing back. The shoulder blades are pinching in towards the spine, so they're retracting. I'm almost thinking as if I was trying to hold a very thin pencil between the shoulder blades. And then as I press my feet down, the kneecaps lift, the muscles in the entire leg engage. Engagement in the glutes allows me to really fix my hips on the floor. And then from there, as I inhale, I can lift the chest up, rolling the shoulders back. The center of the chest aims forward, and I'm keeping my gaze towards the front of the mat. Now, because I prefer to use Cobra Pose as a strengthening pose, I will tend to teach it with little to no weight in the hands, because that really forces us to use the muscles in the back body a little bit more actively. So as we go from that alignment into our upward facing dog, the only difference really is that we are extending, of course, the arms. In order to do that, we do have to engage our hands properly. So I will be using my Hasta Bandha technique, which I will link you to that video here in case you haven't watched it. The other thing that happens, because we're bearing weight on the hands, is that weight is going all the way into our shoulder joint, which again is a comparatively delicate joint. So in order to stabilize the shoulders, I'm going to actively think about spinning my inner elbows forward, which activates the serratus anterior muscle. I talked a little bit about that in the plank and chaturanga video. That's going to help us attach the shoulder blade closer to the rib cage, which has two effects. So firstly, it holds the shoulder in place, and secondly, attaching the shoulder really actively into the rib cage gives us almost a little boost in the back bend in our upper thoracic spine. And through that boost, we can lift the chest a little bit more so that we can really think about back bending through the whole spine evenly, which is what a healthy back bend should be about. And I would always encourage you to focus your back bends as much as you can into this upper thoracic spine area, because when most of us are spending so much time sitting at a desk, rounding from exactly that part of the spine. So when we get into our yoga practice, it's actually really helpful to spend a little bit of time mobilizing that part of the spine in the opposite direction that we would normally be in, so that our spine is still able to maintain mobility and flexibility in the thoracic area, but we're also sort of allowing it to balance out between those two extreme poses, that rounding and the arching. So the other thing that's going on here with the hands is that the hands want to create a little bit of traction. So you're using the hands against the stickiness of your mat, and as if you're trying to pull the hands backwards towards your toes, which again allows your shoulder blades to boost your upper back, but also is going to pull your hips and upper body forward towards the front of the mat, taking you into a deeper back bend. That's why upward facing dog is a slightly deeper back bend than cobra pose. So I will show you that action here now. So I'm going to find my perfect cobra pose. I'm going to press my toes into the floor, engaging the legs, engaging the glutes, lifting through the spine, and then pressing into my hands here. I'm pulling my feet forward, lifting the chest between my arms, keeping my elbows just gently unlocked. And the rest of the engagement is very much the same. My gaze is traveling down my nose. And that is essentially upward facing dog. Now, let's talk a little bit about some common misalignments. I would say as a teacher, the main reasons that people come into bad alignment in their upward dog would be that either they're not quite strong enough yet to do the full pose. I would certainly say that if you can't build up this pose really nicely from the floor, you're probably not ready to do it as part of a flow, certainly. And the other thing that happens is that because we often are doing upward facing dog as part of vinyasa classes, usually by the end of class, people get a little bit tired, and then some of these postures start looking a little bit sloppy. Certainly with upward facing dog, there is definitely a possibility of injury. Of course, as I said, the lumbar spine is a very delicate area here that we're putting a little bit of compression and pressure on. So there is a potential for herniated or slip discs. In the lower spine, there's also the potential for a rotator cuff injury in the shoulder joint. All of that is quite serious and has a very long recovery process. So what I tend to see a lot of in class is that I tend to see people completely disengage their legs, which of course puts more pressure on the lower back. I'll also often see that the shoulders have hunched all the way up to the ears here because they're completely disengaged as well. And then potentially someone has really dropped their head all the way back, lifting the gaze up towards the ceiling. So as I said, with the legs and shoulders being disengaged, you know, whether that's a case of you not having the strength or whether you're just tired at the end of practice, the main fix for that is to dial in your ego and take a step back, come into your cobra pose instead. That will prevent a lot of possibility of injury, and you're working all of the same muscle groups, so you're very actively working towards your upward facing dog. The only real difference is that you're not in quite as deep of a back bend, but there are other places where you will be able to get the same level of back bending in your practice, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. And then the final part, which is the head dropping back. So I do need to address that a little bit separately. So the thing about the head dropping back, a lot of times that comes from more traditional approaches to yoga practice. And realistically, you know, if you're in one of those lineages and you're very attached to practicing your upward facing dog in that way, if you don't have pain symptoms, I don't think it's the biggest issue to continue doing your upward facing dog in that way, because realistically most of us spend so much time looking at our phone like this with our head all the way tilted forward that it's not a huge deal if we spend a little bit of time in our yoga practice looking all the way up. The only reason that I teach this slightly differently, so I tend to mostly deviate from traditional alignment if I have a good reason. And in this case, I think I do. So let me talk you through it. It's a little bit of a weird quirk of the human body. So there is a bone in the throat area that is called the hyoid bone. I've got a slightly strange name. And it's basically located under your jawbone, above your voice box, which is around here, your larynx, and sort of this area here. Essentially, there's some muscles and ligaments that run from the fronts of your collarbones through the hyoid bone, and then they track all the way back and attach to your skull, right around sort of the back of the ear, behind your jawbone. Essentially what that does is that it's created a lever action. So the way that the chest moves in conjunction with your head is a little bit counterintuitive. It's not what you think. So I'll show you from a side view so that you can get a better idea. Essentially, if you are dropping the head back, what happens is that you are those muscles are slightly looser now because you've shortened the distance from the back of your head through the hyoid bone to your collarbones. Now, if you tuck the chin in towards the chest actually, you've now put tension on those strings and the chest is now lifting up towards your chin. So this is the head tilted back and this is the chin drawing in. So as you can possibly see, I don't know if it's visible enough on camera, but maybe also have a little play in your own body to explore that movement. So technically, because as I laid out at the beginning, I think it's very important that we open the front of the body in our back bends. Because of that very reason, I like to keep the chin slightly tucked in so that we are getting more of a lift through the chest and through that lengthening our abdomen a little bit more deeply than we would if we have the head rolling back. But as I said, it also has a little bit to do with your own preference for the pose. So now let's talk about a few modifications and some variations. Let's start with our cobra pose. So of course, the main things that would be causing us some disturbance in both our upward facing dog, or particularly in upward facing dog actually, and less so in cobra pose, would be wrist and shoulder issues. So if you do have wrist or shoulder issues that you are recovering from currently, then of course cobra pose is your best friend, because as I said, really the beauty of it is you don't need to use your hands at all. You could even have the hands by your side a little bit more like a locust pose instead. There's also a few restorative options that I'll go over in a second. Now, if you have lower back pain, or you have gone through a physical therapy program to recover from a herniated or slipped disc, then you do have to continue to be a little bit more mindful in your back bends. And of course, that includes both cobra and upward facing dog. Something that I do like to do once someone has reached a certain level of stability is that I like to take them into Sphinx pose, which literally, if you're unfamiliar, you're emulating the Sphinx statue in Egypt. So essentially you would have the forearms shoulder distance in line with your shoulders, pressing the forearms and fingertips down. You're rolling the shoulders back towards the spine and pressing the feet into the ground so the legs are active. And in this version, it is actually still a very deep back bend, and if anything, it's deeper than Cobra Pose. But what you can do is walk your forearms really far forward so that now you really have especially if you're tucking your glutes slightly under, it really flattens the lower back and keeps it safe. And then you can focus by pulling the forearms back. You can really focus on bending from your thoracic spine, your upper back, rather than the lower back, which I think is a really helpful way of isolating that part of the spine. Now, if you wanted to do Cobra in a little bit more of a restorative way, then you could use a rolled up blanket and slide that underneath your upper rib cage. And again, you can still have the hands here under the shoulders to support yourself and gradually lift a little bit higher. But of course, you could also slowly over time work that blanket a little bit further down, which gives you a little bit more of a boost. Another option that I do like to teach is a moving Cobra Pose. So I usually get my students to create some teepee tents with their fingertips outside of the mat. And from there, you really have a sense that you can plug the shoulders very, very actively in towards the spine. And then with very minimal weight into the fingertips, you actively engage the legs, and then you start to lift the spine as you inhale and exhale to come down. And I usually like to tell my students that on the first round, you put about 10% of your body weight into the fingers, and on your second round, you put about 20%. And each time that you rise up, you put a little bit more weight into your hands, until maybe on your final round, you're putting all of your body weight into the hands and you're in a more of a seal pose variation, which we would often do in yin yoga practice. So again, having spoken about seal pose, you can also use a bolster to support your ribs here. And of course, you can have the hands in front of you, but be mindful because this is more of a lower back bend. And again, if you wanted to deepen that pose, you could again slip that bolster a little bit further down. Now, if you're fairly close to finding your upward facing dog, but you're not quite there, then another option is to have your bolster or a couple of pillows the long way on your mat. And you could have bricks or some hardback books about halfway up the bolster. And from there, you plant the hands on top of your bricks and you place your upper body all the way on top of the bolster. You engage your legs so that the knees lift off the ground. You want the bottom of the bolster to be around where your hips are. And then you can lift the chest so you start to come into a Cobra Pose, and then from there press into the hands and lift off the bolster as much as you can into your upward facing dog. And that is a good way to sort of gradually work your way into it with a little bit of extra support so that you can keep yourself safe. Now, as I said, there's really not that many variations of these poses. As I said, the main one that I tend to use for Cobra Pose is tenting the fingertips outside of the mat and doing it in a more moving way. For upward facing dog, because we usually use it as part of a vinyasa, there's only really one version that I would teach, which is when you move through a 3-point vinyasa. So let me demonstrate that for you. So we would be coming into it from our downward facing dog, the big toes touch, and we come into a 3-legged dog, one leg lifts, and then we inhale forward into a 3-point plank. The leg is still lifted, and we exhale down via or without the knees into our Chaturanga Dandasana. And at this point, the top foot is landing down and I'm untucking the other foot so that I can find my upward facing dog. And that is really one of the main variations, but as you can tell, once we get into upward facing dog, we're back into our symmetrical back bend. And I would say that that's probably probably should cover most things. Of course, if I have left anything out that you would like to share with fellow yogis so that we can create a beautiful resource here for other people, then please share that in the comment section below. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, pop that down there as well. And if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends to spread the good word rather. If you wanted to find me anywhere else online, I will leave that information in the video description. And of course, next week we will talk about vinyasas as a sequence of movement as a whole, so that we can sort of dissect that as its own separate thing. So I hope you enjoyed the video and that you can join me next week in our next Asana Lab, and hope you have a fabulous week until then. Bye, Yogi.